The glass was less than 5 seconds from his mouth when Lena Ortiz switched it. No permission, no warning. Evan Klein's hand froze mid-air as the San Diego room continued like nothing had happened. But what came next destroyed everything she thought she'd done. The man who collapsed 15 minutes later wasn't the billionaire she'd been protecting. The cardiac destabilizer in the glass, calibrated to Grant Holloway's own medication. And security footage revealed someone watching Lena's hands the entire time, tracking her pattern since a Kern County incident 3 years earlier. The dinner wasn't random. Lena's name had been flagged in the system 48 hours before she was hired. Drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe before someone you trust becomes the person testing how predictable you are. Because Lena's about to discover she wasn't hired to serve, she was hired to prove the network could predict exactly what she'd do. There were less than 5 seconds left before the glass reached his mouth, and Lena Ortiz understood that if she was wrong, she would lose her job at best and her freedom at worst. But if she was right and did nothing, the man seated in front of her would be dead before the dessert plates were cleared. The room at the private dining annex near the San Diego waterfront was loud enough to hide mistakes, but quiet enough that intention still mattered. Salt air from the bay mixing with cologne and wine, crystal catching candlelight at tables where men discussed deals worth millions. And as Evan Klein lifted the glass, Lena stepped forward and exchanged it with another already on the table, saying nothing, not meeting his eyes, leaving no space for discussion or consent. Evan's hand froze mid-air, and for 3 seconds the only question was whether he'd call security or let her walk away. 4 seconds had become 3, had become the moment her hand crossed the line between service and interference, and she did not hesitate, because the pattern she'd recognized, the way Grant Holloway had leaned in too casually when the glasses were set. The posture she'd seen once before in Kern County, at a fundraising dinner that ended with an ambulance and an explanation that never made sense, had already made the choice for her before her brain caught up to her hands. Evan stopped mid-motion, his hands suspended where the first glass had been, and he did not ask her what she thought she was doing. He simply set the new glass down, untouched, and watched her retreat toward the service corridor, as if he were watching a door close on a version of the evening that would never exist again. Around them, the Regional Energy Summit continued without interruption. Men from Sacramento and Phoenix discussing land access for utility-scale solar projects, unaware that the most consequential decision of the night had already been made by someone whose name none of them would remember by morning. No one at the main tables noticed the switch, except the one person who wasn't supposed to be watching at all. Lena did not feel brave when she clocked out early through the back exit where security cameras had been repositioned last week. She felt precise, the way a person feels when they've done the math correctly but won't know if the answer is right until someone else checks the work, and she wondered if this was what courage felt like, or if courage was just fear that moved faster than doubt could stop it. Subscribe before you trust the obvious explanation. She drove north on the 5 through Orange County, choosing back roads because instinct told her not to be predictable. And when she noticed headlights, 3 vehicles behind her, that stayed exactly 3 vehicles behind her for 12 minutes before turning off near Del Mar, she understood that the question wasn't whether Evan Klein believed her. It was whether he was the only one watching. By the time she reached her apartment outside Bakersfield, a missed call sat on her phone from a blocked number, and the voicemail was only silence and the sound of someone deciding not to speak. Lena clocked out early and drove north, choosing back roads through Orange County because instinct told her not to be predictable. She had worked banquet service from Riverside to Santa Clarita long enough to recognize when something was off. And tonight the problem had not been the drink itself, but the way Grant Holloway had leaned in too casually when the glasses were set. The posture she'd seen once before in Kern County at a fundraising dinner that ended with an ambulance and an explanation that never made sense. She did not feel brave. She felt precise, the way a person feels when they've done the math correctly, but won't know if the answer is right until someone else checks the work. By the time she reached her apartment outside Bakersfield, a missed call sat on her phone from a blocked number. The voicemail, nothing but silence, and the faint suggestion of someone deciding whether to speak. The silence on the voicemail lasted exactly 7 seconds, long enough for someone to type her address into a search. She did not return it, and she'd learned early in hospitality that the worst part of noticing something wrong wasn't the fear, it was knowing you'd be the one blamed for causing the problem you tried to prevent. Evan Klein stayed through dessert. He shook hands with men from Sacramento, nodded at consultants from Phoenix discussing land access for utility-scale solar projects, performing the role of someone for whom nothing unusual had occurred, even though the glass the waitress had switched still sat untouched on the table. Around him, the Regional Energy Summit continued without interruption, men discussing regulatory shortcuts and property rights, unaware that the most consequential decision of the night had already been made by someone whose name none of them would remember. When Evan reached his car in the parking structure beneath the venue, he sat behind the wheel for 3 full minutes without starting the engine. Replaying the moment, a waitress he had never met reached across him without permission and made a choice that suggested she knew something he didn't. He'd spent 20 years making decisions worth millions, but he couldn't explain why he trusted a woman who'd never spoken to him. His hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. Grant Holloway left the venue less than 15 minutes after Evan did, walking across the parking lot near the I-15 interchange where the air still held the day's heat. He made it halfway to his car before his legs stopped obeying the signals his brain was sending, and he didn't fall so much as fold, knees hitting asphalt first, and then his shoulder, the pain sharp and wrong in his jaw and down his left arm instead of his chest where he expected it. There's a particular kind of pain that announces itself as wrong before it announces itself as dangerous. By the time a valet noticed him and called for help, Grant was still conscious but confused about which part of the evening had gone wrong. The grey sedan appeared outside Lena's building on the second morning, parked 3 spaces down from where it had any reason to be, and she noticed it the way people notice things that don't belong, the out-of-state plates first, then the tinted windows, then the fact that no one had gotten out of it in the 20 minutes she'd been watching from her kitchen window. The Central Valley heat was already building, even though it wasn't yet 9, the kind of dry pressure that made metal too hot to touch and turned parked cars into ovens. Asphalt, soft enough to leave footprints if you stood in one place long enough, and whoever was sitting in that sedan either had the engine running or didn't mind suffering. The question wasn't if they were watching, it was what they were waiting for her to do next. She drove to the grocery store in Delano, because staying in the apartment meant waiting for something to happen, and the sedan didn't follow her, which somehow made it worse, the suggestion that they didn't need to follow because they already knew where she was going. The parking lot was half empty and baking under a cloudless sky, and she was loading bags into her trunk when the Tulare County Sheriff's deputy pulled up beside her, window already down, asking if she knew her left taillight was out, even though she'd replaced it 2 months ago and checked it yesterday, out of the same instinct that was telling her now this conversation had nothing to do with traffic safety. He asked for her license and registration with the kind of politeness that left no room for questions, returned 3 minutes later without writing a citation, and told her to get the taillight fixed. He'd run her information through a system that shouldn't have flagged her for anything, but the pause before he returned her license suggested it had. After he drove away, Lena sat in her car with her hands shaking for the first time since the night at the San Diego venue, wondering if this was how people disappeared not violently but quietly, through a series of decisions that felt reasonable until they weren't. The first explanation arrived that afternoon from San Bernardino County, though explanation wasn't quite the right word for what she heard. A voice on the phone identified itself as federal, but didn't specify which agency. And the first thing they told her was that Grant Holloway had survived the incident in the parking lot, which was how Lena learned that the man who collapsed wasn't the man she thought she'd been protecting. The second thing they told her was that they'd recovered the substance from the glass she'd switched, and they needed to ask her some questions about what she'd seen that night, and the pause that followed suggested the questions would not be optional and the answers would matter in ways she didn't understand yet. Lena asked what was in the glass, the same question she'd been asking herself for 2 days. The response came carefully, as if the person on the other end was choosing words that would tell her enough to keep her cooperative, but not enough to let her see the shape of what she'd stepped into. The substance wasn't poison. Subscribe before you trust the obvious explanation. The first explanation arrived the next morning in San Bernardino County, and it destroyed the assumption everyone would later make about what Lena had done. The substance recovered from the untouched glass was not poison. It was a cardiac destabilizer calibrated to interact with a specific blood pressure medication. Evan Klein did not take blood pressure medication. Grant Holloway did. The dosage required knowledge most people didn't have, and access most people couldn't get, which meant the network wasn't random criminals. They were organized enough to predict what medication someone took before poisoning them. The federal agent on the phone delivered this information in the careful tone of someone explaining that the ground underneath a conversation had shifted without warning. Grant collapsed less than 15 minutes after leaving the venue in a parking lot near the I-15 interchange. He survived because the drink he consumed was incomplete. The glass Lena switched had not saved Evan Klein's life. It had saved Grant Holloway's. Lena sat in her apartment with the phone pressed against her ear, trying to reconcile the pattern she'd recognized Grant's posture, the casual lean with the fact that she'd been right about the method but wrong about the victim. Her courage had been incomplete in the same way the substance in Grant's glass had been incomplete, functional enough to matter but not in the way she'd intended. Lena understood then what it felt like to have your good intentions rewritten as someone else's evidence. That realization forced a second, more unsettling one. The glass had never been meant for Evan at all. Agent Voss let the silence extend long enough that Lena understood this was not the end of the explanation, only the part they were willing to share, before asking what they really wanted to know. The questions that followed were specific in ways that made Lena realize the investigation had been running longer than the dinner itself, and her intervention, however well-intentioned, had compromised something larger than a single evening's surveillance. The operation she'd disrupted had been building for 8 months. 3 executives supposed to be identified that night, and now the network knew federal agents were close, which meant if they couldn't close the case within a week, she'd be the person they'd blame for everything that came after. The federal agent asking these questions already knew the answers, which meant Lena was being tested, not interviewed. Agent Voss asked if Lena had ever met Grant Holloway before that night. The answer was no. She asked if Lena had any connection to the energy projects being discussed at the summit. The answer was no. She asked if anyone had contacted Lena before the dinner to suggest she pay attention to a specific guest. The answer was no, but Lena heard herself hesitate because the question implied someone should have, and the fact that no one did meant her intervention was either incredibly fortunate or incredibly inconvenient, depending on whose perspective mattered. Agent Voss ended the call by telling Lena not to leave Kern County without notifying them first, which sounded like advice but functioned as instruction. If the billionaire wasn't the target, then who was Grant Holloway? By the time Evan reached a federal building in downtown Los Angeles 2 days after the dinner, escorted by people who did not introduce themselves, it was clear the dinner had not been an isolated attempt on anyone's life. The call had come 6 hours after Grant's collapse, asking if Evan could make himself available for a briefing that could not happen over the phone, and the fact that they already knew where he'd be staying suggested the surveillance had started long before the waitress switched the glass. The woman who met him introduced herself as Agent Voss and slid a folder across the table, the kind that required clearance to open. She told Evan that what he was about to see had been building for months. Evan opened the folder. The first name on the list was someone Evan had recommended for a consulting position 3 months ago. The first page listed names from the Energy Summit executives, consultants, attorneys who specialized in regulatory approval for utility-scale projects across California, Arizona, and Nevada. The second page listed incidents. A near-fatal car accident outside Reno that left a solar development consultant hospitalized for 3 weeks. A cardiac event at a Phoenix conference that sidelined a permitting director for 6 months. A severe allergic reaction in Fresno that ended a geologist's involvement in a disputed land survey. Each incident had resulted in project delays, personnel changes, and eventual approvals for developments that had previously faced opposition. The question everyone would ask later wasn't why the network existed, it was why no one had noticed it working for this long. The pattern wasn't random. Every incident targeted someone blocking a land transfer tied to utility-scale energy projects, solar farms, wind installations, battery storage facilities. The deals traced back to shell companies with addresses in Reno and Phoenix, but the pressure came from people who never appeared in contracts. The method was always the same: near-death experiences that looked accidental enough to avoid criminal investigation, but specific enough to make compliance easier than resistance. Every incident happened within 48 hours of a project delay being announced publicly, which meant someone was monitoring filing systems in real time. Voss watched Evan process the information with the patience of someone who had watched others do the same. The dinner in San Diego, she explained, was designed to identify who was feeding information to the network. Evan had been cooperating for weeks, his role known only to a handful of people, and the assumption was that no one outside the circle would intervene, because no one outside knew enough to recognize what was happening. Lena Ortiz was not part of the plan. Her action did not stop the operation, it exposed it too early. Sometimes the worst thing you can do to a criminal investigation is exactly what any decent person would do. Evan asked what happened to people who interfered with investigations like this, and Voss said it depended on whether the interference helped or hurt the case, which was a way of saying they didn't know yet. Voss didn't say how many people had been warned about interfering with federal investigations, but the way she said it suggested the number was smaller than Lena wanted to believe. She asked if Evan had ever spoken to Lena before the dinner, if he'd noticed her watching the table, if anything about her presence struck him as unusual beyond the glass switch. The answer to all 3 questions was no, but Evan understood what the questions were really asking: whether Lena had been placed there intentionally, and whether the investigation had been compromised from the inside or disrupted from the outside. Lena had always believed doing the right thing protected you from consequences, but federal investigations didn't work that way. They just moved the consequences somewhere you couldn't see them coming. Voss closed the folder and told Evan the network was still operational, still applying pressure across 3 states, and the only variable that had changed was that someone was now paying attention closely enough to act. The question no one had answered yet was whether that someone was Lena alone, or whether she'd been trained to notice. Within 48 hours, Lena noticed the grey sedan parked outside her building in Bakersfield again, then again outside a grocery store in Delano, and the repetition felt different this time because whoever was driving it wasn't hiding anymore. The surveillance had shifted from covert to obvious, and the mistakes from earlier, the out-of-state plates, the awkward parking, had disappeared, replaced by precision that suggested either new personnel or a change in strategy. Mistakes were corrected, which meant someone had reviewed the surveillance footage and decided the previous approach wasn't sending the message they needed. There's a moment in most people's lives when they realize someone has been watching them longer than they've been aware of being seen, and that moment changes how they move through every room after it. She drove to Modesto on the fourth day after the dinner, taking Highway 99 north through the Central Valley. The heat was relentless even in late afternoon, and she stopped at a roadside diner outside Turlock because the air conditioning in her car had started failing. Inside, the vinyl booth was sticky against her legs, and the air smelled like grease from the griddle that had been running since morning. And she sat near the window watching a family 3 tables over, parents and 2 kids, arguing about whether pancakes counted as dinner, and for 45 seconds the noise was ordinary and loud and safe. Then her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize, and the moment collapsed. The text was her full name, spelled correctly, which meant whoever sent it had access to records that didn't misspell Ortiz the way the deputy's software had 3 days ago. No message, no threat, just her name. The text arrived exactly 3 minutes after she paid her check, which meant they'd been close enough to see her stand up. The silence was more frightening than action, because silence required her to fill in the gaps with imagination. She paid for coffee she hadn't finished, and drove the rest of the way to Modesto without stopping. And when she arrived at her mother's house, she didn't go inside, just sat in the driveway for 10 minutes, trying to decide whether visiting would protect her mother or expose her. Agent Voss called that evening from a different number and told Lena they'd reviewed security footage from the San Diego venue. The footage confirmed what federal investigators had suspected. A man standing near the service entrance on the night of the dinner, badge clipped just high enough to look official, positioned where Lena would pass, and his eyes never left her hands from the moment she picked up the tray until she switched the glass. The man watching her hands had been positioned there for at least 15 minutes before she arrived, which meant he'd known her route through the service corridor before she did. The switch had been anticipated. The story everyone assumed they were watching a waitress saving a powerful stranger was wrong. Voss paused long enough for Lena to ask the question she'd been avoiding, which was whether anyone else had ever intervened the way she had. The answer was no. That was the problem. Lena asked about the man in the footage, and Voss said they'd run the badge number through every database available. The badge didn't exist in any system, which meant it had been created specifically for that night. But creating a fake badge required authorization from someone who understood how real badges were made. The camera angle wasn't positioned like normal security footage either. It was angled down toward the service corridor, not the dining tables, as if someone had adjusted it days before to capture exactly what it captured. Someone had authorized the man to be there. Someone had repositioned the camera. Someone had been watching Lena before she knew she was worth watching. Subscribe before you miss who's watching you. The question no one could answer yet was why she'd been allowed close enough to the glass to matter at all. Agent Voss called on the 6th day with information about Evan's meeting in Maricopa County, Arizona. A meeting arranged by federal investigators who needed to understand why someone inside the coercion network would agree to become a target of his own operation, and what she told Lena inverted everything about the story Lena thought she'd been living. Grant Holloway was not a victim. He was an internal control. His collapse was supposed to look accidental, proof to the rest of the group that resistance carried consequences even when it came from someone they trusted. The cardiac destabilizer, calibrated to his own medication, was meant to demonstrate reach without killing him. Lena's intervention had disrupted the calibration, not the intent. The federal investigators had known about Grant's role for 6 weeks, but waited to tell Lena because they needed to confirm she wasn't part of the network testing its own security. And someone had been watching her when she made the switch. The security footage was more specific than Agent Voss had initially suggested. The man at the service entrance wasn't watching random staff. He was positioned exactly where Lena would pass, based on the overflow station assignment she'd received 3 days before the dinner. Federal investigators reviewing scheduling records found that Lena's name had been flagged in the system 48 hours before she was hired, a notation visible only to someone with administrative access. Someone had reviewed her employment history before the dinner. 9 years in hospitality across Riverside, Kern County, and Santa Clarita. 2 formal citations for intervening in guest conflicts without management approval. A reprimand in Kern County 3 years earlier for calling an ambulance before the host gave permission, an incident that ended with a guest surviving, but the host losing a development deal within a month. Federal agents reviewing that case now suspected the Kern County fundraiser was an early test of the same network, and Lena had been in their system ever since. Someone had been documenting her pattern of intervention for 3 years, which meant the dinner in San Diego wasn't the first time she'd been tested, it was just the first time she'd passed. She had a pattern of not following protocol when something felt wrong, and someone had decided that pattern was worth testing. The overflow station assigned 3 days before the dinner. The security cameras repositioned to angle down at the service corridor. The badge created for one night. The glass placed where Lena would see it if she was paying attention the way her record suggested she would. None of it was accidental. The switch had been anticipated because Lena's intervention wasn't random. It was probable based on data someone had been collecting for years. We like to believe our choices define us, but sometimes our choices just confirm what someone else already knew about who we are. The story was no longer about a waitress saving a stranger. It was about interference in an operation designed to measure how predictable human behavior could be when variables were controlled. Her action hadn't been heroic. It had been expected, which made it data instead of courage. The network had bet she'd intervene, and they'd been right, which made her predictable enough to manipulate or predictable enough to eliminate, depending on which outcome served them better. The network had been watching her long before she knew she was worth watching, and the question no one could answer yet was whether they'd been watching to recruit her or to eliminate the unpredictability she represented. Lena wondered how many other moments in her life had felt like free will, but were actually just her following a pattern someone else had already mapped. Voss ended the call by saying Lena should expect contact within the next 48 hours, though she didn't specify from whom or for what purpose. Why was she the one they watched? When Evan finally called Lena from a number routed through 3 states, he did not thank her. He told her the truth. What she did had protected someone who was never supposed to survive that night, and in doing so, it had marked her as an anomaly the network would not ignore. If she disappeared quietly, the pressure would fade. If she spoke, the pressure would spike before it broke. Evan didn't say which option he'd choose if he were her, which told Lena more than any answer could have. There was a pause long enough for traffic to pass beneath an overpass near Fresno, where Lena had pulled over, because driving while listening to someone explain the shape of her mistake seemed dangerous. How long have you known? Since Grant woke up in the hospital. And you waited 6 days to tell me. I waited 6 days to know if telling you would help. She asked what help looked like when the only options were becoming evidence or pretending she'd never touched the glass, and Evan said help looked like survival, which wasn't the same as justice and wasn't meant to be. Did anyone else ever do what I did? No. The answer came without hesitation, which made it worse. The confirmation that whatever instinct had moved her hand was rare enough to be valuable or dangerous, depending on whose assessment carried weight. The answer came too quickly, as if Evan had been waiting for someone to ask that specific question for months. What would you have done? If you were me, I don't know. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. The line went quiet long enough that Lena thought he'd hung up, but then she heard him breathing on the other end, the sound of someone trying to say something that didn't have words yet. When he spoke again, his voice carried exhaustion that comes from decisions that don't feel like choices. The network you stepped into has been running for 3 years across 6 states. Every person who resisted ended up backing down or hospitalized. You're the first person who saw it happening and did something without being asked, and that makes you either the best witness they could hope for or the worst variable they could tolerate. The difference comes down to whether you're willing to testify. Knowing testimony makes you visible to people who've spent years staying invisible. Testifying meant becoming the one variable the network couldn't predict, which was either the safest position or the most dangerous one, depending on how much they valued control over revenge. Lena asked if testifying would stop them, and Evan said, maybe. Gratitude sounds different when it's wrapped in a warning. What happens if I don't? You go back to work. You don't talk about the dinner. The investigation continues without you. And the network keeps operating until we find another way. The choice didn't feel heroic. It felt like choosing between two versions of disappearing, one loud and one quiet, and neither guaranteed safety or the satisfaction of knowing the choice mattered beyond the moment it was made. She'd always believed heroic choices came with clarity, but this felt like choosing between two mistakes and hoping one of them hurt less. Anyone who'd ever intervened when they shouldn't have knew the feeling, the moment you realize helping made you responsible for everything that came after. The brief calm that followed felt unnatural. No calls, no car, 2 full days of silence as Lena drove to Modesto to check on her mother and considered how easily a life could narrow without announcing itself. The grey sedan that had been tracking her movements had disappeared on the 7th day, and the absence was worse than the presence because it suggested the surveillance had evolved into something she couldn't see. The sedan's disappearance could have meant they'd stopped watching, but Lena had learned enough in 8 days to know it probably meant they'd started watching from somewhere she couldn't see anymore. She knocked on her mother's door in the early afternoon, the porch wood hot enough to feel through her shoes. The residential street so quiet that cars on the next block over sounded louder than they should. When her mother opened it, Lena didn't explain what had happened at the dinner, or why the past week had felt like standing in a room where the walls were moving closer. She said her mother should stay with her sister in Clovis for a few days, just until some work complications settled, and her mother looked at her the way mothers look at daughters who are lying, and asked what kind of complications required leaving town. Lena said the kind that were easier to handle if she knew her mother wasn't alone, and her mother said that wasn't an answer, and Lena said it was the only one she could give. The conversation ended with her mother agreeing to call her sister but not promising to leave, and Lena understood that protecting someone you love means keeping them in the dark, even when the truth might save them. Her mother's voice had that edge it got when she knew Lena was lying but loved her too much to force the truth, and that made leaving harder than any threat could have. The investigation moved quietly through Nevada and into Utah, while Lena waited for contact that didn't come. Agent Voss called once to say subpoenas were replacing threats and patterns were tightening, which sounded like progress but felt like delay. Lena asked if the network knew federal agents were close, and Voss said probably, which meant the calm wasn't because they'd forgotten her, but because they were recalibrating. What would you do if protecting yourself meant abandoning everyone, counting on you to speak? On the 8th night, Lena returned to her apartment outside Bakersfield after a shift at a catering company in Fresno, where the industrial kitchen's fluorescent hum had given her a headache that lasted through the drive home, and she noticed the piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper before she noticed the parking lot was emptier than it should have been. The paper was folded once, no envelope, no marking. She unfolded it under the parking lot lights. Her name was written in printed letters, no message below it, no threat or instruction. Just her name, spelled correctly this time, which meant whoever left it had access to records that didn't make the mistakes the deputy's software had made a week ago. The precision was intentional, the same way everything else had been intentional. The precision of her name, no smudges, no errors, suggested it had been printed, not handwritten, which meant someone had typed it into a system before bringing it here. Subscribe while she still has a choice. The note wasn't a warning. It was confirmation that the brief calm had been tactical, that federal protection, if it had ever existed, had created a gap the network had found, and that whatever choice Lena thought she still had already narrowed to a single option she hadn't been given yet. She looked around the parking lot for the grey sedan, or the man with the badge that didn't exist, but the lot was empty and the silence felt deliberate. The glass had never been the point. The choice still wasn't over. In Oakland, a federal clerk slid a disclosure form across a desk and waited. Lena held the pen without writing, aware that whatever she put down would decide whether the story ended with her returning to work unnoticed or becoming evidence in something much larger than her. The form had questions about what she saw and when she saw it, and whether anyone had asked her to intervene, and the spaces for answers were too small for the truth and too large for lies that would hold up under scrutiny. The clerk had probably seen hundreds of people sign these forms without reading them carefully, and Lena wondered how many of those people regretted it later when the questions they'd answered became testimony they couldn't take back. The clerk was younger than Lena expected, professional in a way that suggested this was routine, even if it wasn't routine for the people sitting across the desk filling out forms that could reshape their lives. She didn't offer encouragement or pressure, just waited with the patience of someone who had watched hundreds of people make this same decision. The fluorescent hum in the room made it feel colder than it was. Through the window behind the clerk, Oakland fog rolled through the streets, thick enough to soften building edges and make traffic lights look like suggestions, carrying the smell of bay water and exhaust that never quite left the air downtown. Lena could see part of the parking structure, and on the third level, where concrete amplified engine sounds, a grey sedan idled where it shouldn't, engine running, windows tinted in a way that made it impossible to tell if anyone was inside, or whether the surveillance was federal protection or network pressure. The grey sedan's position gave it a clear view of the building entrance, but not the parking structure exit, which meant they either hadn't planned for her to run, or they'd positioned a second vehicle somewhere she hadn't spotted yet. The clerk glanced at her watch, aware that time was passing and decisions made at desks like this one didn't get more clear the longer you stared at blank spaces. Lena asked if she could take the form home to review it, and the clerk said no. The disclosure had to be completed in the building, under supervision. Lena looked at the questions again. Had anyone contacted her before the dinner? Had she recognized anyone at the event? Had she been trained to identify substances or patterns? The questions assumed a version of her that didn't exist, someone deliberate instead of instinctive, but the answers would create that version regardless, because that's what federal testimony did. It turned complicated moments into clean narratives. She thought about Evan's voice on the phone, telling her that help looked like survival instead of justice. She thought about her mother in Modesto, still refusing to leave for Clovis. She thought about the Kern County fundraiser 3 years ago, when she'd called an ambulance without permission, and wondered if that decision had been the beginning of this one. A pattern someone had been tracking long enough to predict what she'd do when they put her close enough to matter. Some people would call what she did at the dinner brave. Others would call it interference. The federal government would call it whatever served their case, and none of those definitions changed what actually happened or what it cost. The pen was light in her hand, ballpoint standard issue, the kind that required pressure to make marks that would last. The federal government required ink signatures on documents that would determine whether she lived the rest of her life as a protected witness or an unprotected liability, and the difference came down to which name she wrote and whether she wrote it at all. Outside, fog obscured the grey sedan for a moment before clearing again, and Lena understood that whether she signed or walked away, the surveillance would continue, because the question wasn't whether she was willing to testify, it was whether she was valuable enough to protect or dangerous enough to contain. She'd spent her whole life believing choices got easier with information, But having all the facts just made it clearer that both options led somewhere she didn't want to go. Anyone who'd ever had to choose between protecting themselves and doing what's right knew there was no winning, just degrees of losing you could live with. The clerk waited. Outside, a grey sedan idled where it shouldn't. The glass had never been the point. The choice still wasn't over.